Hi, my name's James Booth, and this is my EUN231 Assessment 2 Showcase and Reflection on Personal Experience. So on this placement, I was given the opportunity to teach grade 12 biology. This school had quite a low socioeconomic background. As you can see that there from the distribution of social educational advantage graph, most students are in the bottom quarter to lower mid quarter of the spectrum. And on top of that, in 2019, which is the latest data available, only 9% of students that graduated went on to study at university, while 23% went to TAFE, and another 24% were employed. This data was all taken from my school. So as you can tell, this school is quite a low socioeconomic school and not that academic traditionally. So the key learning intentions. So last year, the biology students did really poor on the external exam, which of course is worth 50%. So when I was talking to my supervising teacher, she said she really wanted me to put an emphasis on teaching for that exam, so the school could improve their ranking and their students could do better. So I was preparing students for that summative final exam by teaching them the content they needed to know. I was teaching them Unit 4, which is DNA structure replication, cellular replication, and variation, as well as genome expression. So I was teaching them 3 different chapters from their textbook, and I was measuring their learning through both pre and post-exam tests, but as well as using other formative assessment, as I'll talk about later. So with this class, the core teaching strategies I used to check for evidence in learning, I used a couple. So one of them was I did a pre-test, which is a diagnostic assessment. And I used that to be able to gauge how much the students knew about the topic we were about to start learning about, whether I had to teach it from scratch or whether they had a small amount of base knowledge that I could base it off. Another thing that I emphasized a lot was the students being able to demonstrate the WILF. So what I am looking for each lesson. And one way that I did this was using exit tickets every lesson, which is a type of formal assessment. So I would give them a question written on the exit ticket that related directly to the WILF and the WALT of that lesson. And they had to answer that, give it back to me. I would mark it, and then I would give it to them back the next lesson. And they would get personal feedback off that, as well as I would also give the class general tips about things that a lot of people didn't quite understand about that topic. So yep, that feeds into giving feedback. So as I said, I gave feedback based off the exit ticket every lesson to each student to help them kind of learn and correct any misconceptions that they had about certain topics. So I also used a gradual release of responsibilities to answer practice exam questions throughout. So that's where I do a lot of modeling. So I do it, we do it together, they do it in groups, and they do it alone. And you can do that with all different types of questions just to get them comfortable. And being a quite a low literacy class, that was really good to be able to do that and to demonstrate the modeling for them. So at the end of every topic covered, I did a revision lesson with example questions to go through. And at the end, I did a post-assessment, which post-test, which was my formative assessment again, which was just the pre-test done at the end. So I could tell from the beginning and the end how much they'd learned in between. So using these types of formative assessments allows us to evaluate student comprehension, learning needs, and academic progression. So I have here an example exit ticket with feedback from one of my lessons. The WILF for this lesson was students' ability to differentiate between DNA in eukaryotes and prokaryotes. So the exit ticket question they were given was contrast 2 differences between DNA found in eukaryotes and prokaryotes. And I told them how many marks it was worth. And then here's a student, given an example here of a student who didn't answer this question quite so well. They got muddled. They got eukaryotes and prokaryotes confused around the wrong way. And they also only mentioned that eukaryotes DNA is round around histones, and they didn't say anything about how it is in prokaryotes. So I wrote them feedback to let them know what they've got wrong there. So like I said before with this class, I did a pre and post test that I created myself. And this test had a mix of multiple choice and short answer questions, much like the real exam that they're going to have. Also, their assessment for this semester actually was another exam that looked similar to this, but obviously I didn't use any of the questions that were in their final in their exam on this exam, but they were based around the same material and the same sort of questions. So yep, that was short response questions here. As you can see, they all come from 3 different chapters there. DNA of structure and replication, cellular replication variation, and gene expression. This is great because when I marked it, I could give them individual feedback of what chapter they needed to work on more to enable to improve. So evidence of learning. So here's the results from how my class did on the pre-test and the post-test. So you can see there in blue, it's the pre-test. And the average mark at the pre-test was about 22%. So students only got about 22% on the entire exam before they started. And by the end of the post-test, that mark had improved to about 57%. So it had doubled, which was great. And I was very happy with that response. And so was my supervising teacher. And I gave students actually individual feedback on each one. Like I said, because I had split their marks down individually into the 3 different chapters, I was able to give each student individual feedback on what chapter they were the weakest in and what they needed to improve. So evidence for learning. So here's an example of some of the feedback that I gave them on an exam questions. So you can see here, this is the same student. The student A was a response in the pre-test. They just didn't answer because they didn't know anything about what we're talking about. Versus on the post-test, they'd answered the question correctly, and they got 2 out of 2. They did a great job. So possible improvements I can make to my pedagogy from this practical, or this class in particular, was I could definitely use the gradual release of responsibilities more in every lesson. So you're supposed to build towards that, and sometimes I would use it, go through the whole entire I do, we do together, they do in groups, they do alone in one lesson, and other times I wouldn't do any of it in any lesson. So I think using this approach, you're supposed to gradually build up. You don't necessarily have to do it all in one lesson, but it can be like I do, we do together one lesson, and then the next lesson could be they do in groups and then they do alone. So yeah, working on that and making that functional across every lesson to really hone in those skills to make them individual independent learners would have been great. So improving my teaching resources so students can learn even more effectively. But on this practical, I felt quite strained, having to make the resources just a day before I was teaching. And obviously, the more time I have to create resources, the better I can make those resources. So in the future, giving myself more time to be able to plan these resources more effectively. And also giving better feedback to students. So both in terms of generalized feedback to the class and personalized. It's a skill that I need to work on, and I did get a chance to develop that quite a bit while I was on my placement, but I would still like to improve on that further. So here's a couple of references that I used today, and they're also in my assignment as well.